coffee prices hit record highs. 7 of the most popular coffee brands have quietly doubled in price at Walmart and Costco. That's how the Wall Street Journal and Business Insider have been sounding the alarm in recent weeks. At first glance, it looks like just another price hike, but dig a little deeper and you'll find a tangled web of tariff wars, climate disasters, and financial speculation brewing underneath every cup. And now, from Phoenix to Toronto, Americans and Canadians alike are waking up to a very bitter morning routine, where their $3 coffee suddenly costs $6. So here's the real question. When your morning coffee becomes a casualty of international politics, who do you blame? For decades, the coffee trade between North and South America was one of the most stable and mutually beneficial supply chains in the Western Hemisphere. Brazil, the undisputed king of global coffee exports, supplied nearly 40% of the beans that fueled morning rituals across the US and Canada. From espresso in New York to drip brews in Vancouver, the flow of Arabica and Robusta beans was seamless. Retail giants like Walmart, Costco, and Tim Hortons built entire business models on the premise of cheap, reliable coffee, and in turn, Brazil thrived off consistent demand from its largest northern clients. But the first cracks in this relationship began to form as geopolitical winds shifted. When former President Donald Trump returned to the campaign trail with promises of protecting American agriculture, coffee, ironically a crop hardly grown in the U.S., was added to the list of vulnerable imports. In early 2025, citing unfair pricing practices and currency manipulation, the Trump administration implemented a sweeping 50% tariff on coffee imports from Brazil. Brazil didn't stay silent. Within weeks, they filed a formal complaint with the World Trade Organization, calling the move unjustified economic aggression. Meanwhile, climate-related catastrophes, droughts, freak frosts, and crop failures were already reducing Brazil and Vietnam's yields by up to 39%, according to Reuters and the International Coffee Organization. The stage was now set. What had once been a simple bean trade was transforming into a battleground. On one side, American populist protectionism. On the other, global trade norms, environmental fragility, and supply chain vulnerability. The caffeine high that North America had enjoyed for decades was beginning to wear off, fast. In early February 2025, in a televised cabinet meeting that would later ignite controversy, former President Donald Trump leaned forward into the microphone and declared, "We've done steel, we've done aluminum, we've done lumber. Today, we're doing coffee." It wasn't just a passing remark. Within 48 hours, a formal executive order slapped a 50% tariff on all coffee imports from Brazil, retroactively effective to January 1st. The rationale? Trump's trade team cited what they described as a systematic manipulation of global commodity prices by Brazil and Vietnam, accusing the countries of flooding the U.S. market with cheap coffee, hurting American workers in roasting and distribution. But critics pointed out an obvious flaw. The U.S. barely produces any coffee, and certainly not at scale. This move blindsided the American food and beverage industry. The National Coffee Association issued an emergency bulletin stating that the tariffs would unquestionably be passed down to consumers, with projections that wholesale prices would spike 20 to 30% within a month. Starbucks, Dunkin', and countless independent roasters began reevaluating supply contracts. Meanwhile, shares of Keurig Dr. Pepper and J.M. Smucker, two of the largest U.S. coffee distributors, fell sharply. Axios reported Smucker lost $3.2 billion in market value within 72 hours of the announcement, citing unexpected import tax costs. Economists weren't surprised. The Tax Foundation had warned in 2024 that broad tariffs would do more harm than good, especially when applied to consumer staples. The foundation's senior analyst called it a political maneuver disguised as economic patriotism. But the Trump administration pressed forward, doubling down with populist rhetoric. At a rally in Tampa, Trump told a crowd of supporters, "Why should Brazil be the one waking America up every morning? We can roast our own beans." Except that wasn't quite true. According to USDA data, over 95% of the coffee consumed in the U.S. is imported, and with Brazil and Vietnam accounting for nearly 60% of that supply, the math didn't add up. The shock wasn't limited to importers. Restaurants and cafes, already reeling from inflation and labor shortages, now faced yet another blow. The American Restaurant Association issued a grim projection. The average cost of a cup of coffee would rise by 50 cents to $1 across the country. Small businesses, especially in low-margin markets like diners and convenience stores, had little room to absorb those increases. As tariffs trickled through the supply chain, headlines followed. 7 major coffee brands raised prices by up to 30%. Business Insider, Costco customers see double-priced K-Cups. The New York Post, Trump's coffee tariffs brew backlash in the suburbs. AP News from the Oval Office, it may have seemed like a strategic move to assert dominance in trade talks, but for millions of Americans reaching for their morning coffee, it was an unwelcome wake-up call. North of the border, the shockwave hit just as hard, but in a very different way. Unlike the US, Canada didn't impose any retaliatory tariffs. Instead, the Trudeau government attempted to distance itself from Washington's escalating trade policy. But Canada's heavy reliance on shared supply chains meant it couldn't escape the consequences. A full third of Canada's coffee imports are routed through American distributors. So when prices spiked in New York and Los Angeles, Toronto and Vancouver felt it too, almost immediately. Summit Coffee, a boutique roaster based in Ontario, reported wholesale price hikes of over 28% within just 6 weeks. "We had no time to adjust," said operations manager Laura Chen. "The beans come through U.S. ports, even if they're sourced from Vietnam. Suddenly, everything became more expensive." Roasters and cafes across Canada scrambled to find alternative import routes, bypassing U.S. intermediaries. Some looked to Europe. Others explored direct trade deals with Central American suppliers. But the switch wasn't simple. As one logistics executive explained to Bloomberg Canada, "We're talking about rerouting entire shipping contracts, retooling customs paperwork, and facing fresh bottlenecks at Montreal and Halifax. It's chaos." Consumers didn't fare much better. According to a MarketWatch report, retail chains like Tim Hortons quietly raised prices by 10 to 15 cents per cup by mid-March. In urban centers like Calgary, anecdotal reports showed large households turning to bulk purchases, storing ground coffee in freezers to hedge against future price hikes. Meanwhile, Canada's own cafe culture began to feel the squeeze. Independent coffee shops, a cornerstone of downtown communities, started losing customers to cheaper alternatives or fast food chains with stronger price buffers. "People aren't abandoning coffee," said food economist Dr. Marie Dubois. "They're just downgrading. Instead of a $5 artisan pour-over, they're grabbing a $2 gas station brew." The psychological toll was also growing. In a subtle but symbolic shift, coffee panic became a trending topic on Canadian social media in early April. TikTok videos of shoppers hoarding beans went viral. The phrase, $20 for a bag of beans, became a punchline and a warning. And still, Ottawa remained diplomatically cautious. "We do not believe in using trade as a weapon," Prime Minister Trudeau said during a press briefing. But behind closed doors, Canadian trade officials were reportedly furious at being dragged into yet another tariff war not of their making. The contrast couldn't be starker. America had chosen to weaponize coffee. Canada, meanwhile, found itself stuck between preserving trade relationships and shielding its citizens from the fallout of someone else's war. By summer 2025, the tariff standoff had reached a stalemate. The Trump administration refused to back down, even as legal challenges mounted and prices soared. Brazil's complaint sat in the WTO's dispute queue, unresolved. Canada, despite its diplomatic maneuvering, remained economically entangled in a mess it couldn't fully avoid, and consumers on both sides of the border kept paying more. Supply chains tried to adapt, but the damage was done. The New York coffee auction, once a dull affair, became a volatile casino where beans traded like Bitcoin. Futures contracts for Arabica hit $4.30 per pound, a level not seen in over a decade. Speculators thrived, producers and buyers suffered. Meanwhile, U.S. politicians offered little clarity. Some Republicans doubled down, touting the tariff as a win for American sovereignty. Democrats, on the other hand, accused Trump of waging a war on breakfast. Stuck in the middle were millions of North Americans, baristas, business owners, and caffeine addicts caught in a policy labyrinth with no clear exit. The result? A bitter brew of political theater, economic strain, and global confusion. And with every passing month, the cost of indecision rises, cup by cup. In the heart of Saskatchewan, a family-run cafe called Maple Bean faced a decision no small business wants to make: raise prices or close its doors. For 17 years, the cafe had served as a community hub in Regina, a place where farmers, teachers, and students alike gathered over mugs of fair trade Colombian or Brazilian coffee. But by May 2025, the cost of their imported beans had nearly doubled. "We were paying $9 per pound last year. Now it's pushing $16, said co-owner Claire Mendez in an interview with CBC Business. That's before shipping, taxes, or rent. Canada's dependence on U.S.-based coffee distributors had created an invisible chokehold. Even though the federal government didn't impose new tariffs, supply disruptions from U.S. ports and the spike in global futures prices were enough to push smaller players to the brink. In fact, according to data from Statistics Canada, wholesale coffee import costs jumped 32% in Q1 2025, the steepest increase since the 1980s. The hardest hit were rural communities and small towns. Large chains like Tim Hortons and McDonald's had corporate contracts and logistical infrastructure to absorb the shock. Independent cafes, however, did not. According to the Canadian Independent Business Alliance, nearly 12% of small coffee retailers had reported serious risk of closure by mid-2025 due to unrecoverable cost pressures directly tied to U.S. trade actions. But it wasn't just about money. Coffee culture in Canada, often seen as slower, more deliberate, more community-oriented, was cracking under pressure. The ripple effects extended to local dairy suppliers, delivery drivers, and even ceramic mug makers. One Montreal-based supplier, Nordique Ceramics, saw a 40% drop in orders by April. "Less coffee means fewer mugs. It's that simple," said founder Jules Bernier. "It's like a silent recession for artisans." From port cities like Halifax to prairie towns in Alberta, the mood was the same: frustration, fatigue, and a sense of helplessness. Canada wasn't a combatant in this trade war, but it was still bleeding. Back in the US, the economic blowback was sharper and more ironic. Take Cooperative Coffee Roasters, a small operation based in Asheville, North Carolina. Known for its sustainable sourcing and loyal local following, the company had spent years building relationships with Brazilian farmers. But with tariffs now hiking their raw costs by 50%, owner Marcus Lee was forced to raise prices from $11 to $14 per pound. That $3 may sound small until you multiply it across thousands of orders. "It's not just us," Marcus told The Sun. "We're hearing from cafes in Michigan, Oregon, even Texas. They're all on the edge." At Walmart and Costco, customers began noticing price jumps as early as March. A pack of K-Cups that once cost $18 now hovered around $26. For many families, this wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was yet another hit in a year of economic stress. According to a MarketWatch poll, 1 in 5 Americans reported either cutting back on coffee purchases or switching to cheaper, lower-quality brands. Some began stockpiling, creating flash shortages and further inflating prices. Others simply gave up daily coffee altogether. The irony? U.S. consumers, supposedly the beneficiaries of the tariffs, were now paying more, not less. And with no meaningful domestic production to replace imports, even Trump supporters in red states were beginning to feel the sting. Even large companies weren't immune. J.M. Smucker Co., which owns Folgers and Café Bustelo, lost 15.6% of its market capitalization in a single quarter. Their CEO blamed tariff-driven cost explosions and warned investors that future earnings guidance is being revised downward. And the human toll didn't end with shareholders. Baristas in big cities began losing hours as foot traffic declined. Equipment suppliers saw fewer orders. Even packaging manufacturers took a hit as bulk orders were cut. People think tariffs only hurt the other side, said retail analyst Kendra Morales. But this isn't a zero-sum game. When coffee costs double, someone pays for it, and increasingly, that someone is you. Coffee had become more than just a drink. It was now a symbol of broken policy, miscalculated politics, and the very real cost of turning trade into a weapon. Across coffee shops, supermarkets, and breakfast tables, the same question lingers. How did a simple bean become a battleground? The United States, in an attempt to flex economic muscle, ended up punching its own supply chain. Canada, caught in the crossfire, watched its calm cafe culture unravel without firing a single shot. And Brazil, the largest coffee supplier in the world, hasn't blinked. This isn't just about coffee anymore. It's about how global trade, political posturing, and climate volatility are colliding at the kitchen table. So where does North America go from here? Will we rewire our supply chains or just brew resentment one cup at a time? Like this video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth stories that matter on both sides of the border.